When we speak of Anglo-Saxons today, a lot of people think we're talking about four-letter words. But did you know that there are no cuss words, no impolite words that come down to us from Anglo-Saxon times? Now, I'm sure they had those terms, but all of the documentation we have about Anglo-Saxon language comes from monks and from priests who documented the Anglo-Saxon culture. And while they're very frank and open about the culture, they're not that frank and open. And so we have no cuss words that are Anglo-Saxon. Those came later with seafaring. But we do have a concept of paying for your crimes, which is very much Anglo-Saxon. They actually had a price list for different crimes. And if you committed them, that was the price you paid. And it was a sliding scale, of course, depending on the rank of the person that you offended. But the interesting thing was the payment went directly to the victim.
Good morning. This course is a little different from my usual course. This one is going to cover 1,000 years of English history. But even I wouldn't try to cover everything that happens in 1,000 years. So instead, we're going to focus on 7 events, times, and people. And these events and these people all contribute to the development of an idea that government is a contract between people based on justice and representation. And the ancestors that come to this continent bring with them the ideas that are developed across these next 8 weeks. And they build a new government around the idea, the one we live with today. And so as we go back in time across that 1,000 years, you're going to recognize the ideas and the things that we say and believe today. Now, you can make an argument for a whole lot of other people during that time, but this is my course, so I got to pick. What I invite you to do is to read other books about these times and about British history to discover some of the other ideas and people that I had to omit. Today we're going to spend most of our time with some early tribesmen from the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. They start out as a loose confederation of Germanic tribes that come to the British Isles around 600 and pretty much rule it until 1066. But since this is pretty far back in time, I'm going to go even farther back and give you a framework for them. A diverse people have inhabited England, Scotland, Wales, Cornwall, and Ireland for thousands and thousands of years. And I'm going to talk a little bit about a people 5,000 years ago, Stone Age Britain. They're the people who built the standing stones. Now, not the big ones that you see in Stonehenge. Those come later, about 2000 BCE with the Beaker people. But 5000 BCE, there were an earlier people, and they created the first of the stone circles. And one of the oldest one is in the Orkney Islands, off the northern Scottish coast. But don't be surprised to find that these are a very sophisticated people. They have a thriving stone village next to their standing circle. It has fences. It has shelves where they put things. They raised cattle. They had pets. They fished. One of the houses, in fact, had a stone pit in it where they kept live bait, a Stone Age aquarium. Other houses had stone drains that puzzled archaeologists for quite a while, and what they finally decided is those are the first indoor privies, 5,000 BCE. But of course, if there's any people on earth that are highly motivated not to go outside and drop your drawers, I would think the people of northern Scotland would be. And that brings me to my point that climate and geography are massive forces in the history of human beings. And once you look at that, you realize that the fact that Great Britain is an island, Scotland, Wales, and England share an island. That pretty much explains a great deal about their history, because they're close enough to the continent to have communication, and yet far enough away to control the population. So despite that very treacherous North Sea and the English Channel, people do cross from the mainland Europe. But what happens is the waters are so treacherous that each group of immigrants, each group of invaders, is much smaller when they get to Britain than they were when they started. And so the population is small enough that it is merged in time into the greater population. Now, most of us really only start recognizing the tribal names when we get to the Celts. The Celts show up in the archaeological record sometime between 1000 and 800 BCE. There's some argument about when they get to England, sometime between 700 and 420 BCE. But over 2,500 years later, they're still there in Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Cornwall, Brittany, and in the blood of the nations where their children immigrated. The Romans finally invaded after 2 failures under Emperor Claudius in the year 43. The Roman occupation lasted from 43 to 410. The Celtic tribes appear to have adopted Roman culture rather widely. Now, that does not mean they welcomed the invaders. They certainly did not. There were a number of very bloody revolutions. Boudica and Hadrian's Wall are pretty good examples of that. But the archaeological record again shows us that the Celtic tribes loved the baths, loved those Roman roads, and they really loved access to Roman trade. And the Romans were pretty devoted to Britain because it was a rich prize. Tacitus called it worthy of conquest because it had a lot of arable land and it had metal wealth. There was gold in Wales, iron in the forests of Dean, lead in North Wales, Derbyshire, and Yorkshire, tin in Cornwall. And the island's geography helped and hindered control of the island. In the north and the west, there are hills and mountains as high as 4,000 square feet. They're colder, there's a lot more rainfall, rocky soil, hard places to live in, but easy places to defend and control access and trade. In the middle and southern portions, in those days, there's mile after mile after mile of fens and swamps. Some river valleys, some cleared lands, good places to raise corn and sheep and cattle. And so the island was also rich in food and leather and wool. When Rome retreated from Britain in 410, the tribes that had been held at bay, the Picts from the north, the Irish from the west, and the Germanic tribes from the east, all attacked the island. What made it worse was, as soon as the Romans are gone, the Celts are attacking each other. Essentially what happened when Rome retreated from its colonies in 410, the same chaos breaks out that we know so well when the Soviet Union fell. And for precisely the same reason. Just as the Soviets had, the Romans had squelched the tribal cultures and their hostilities. And so as soon as they leave, ancient hatreds, ancient ambitions come up, and they attack one another for land and for power. And so the years from 410 to 620 or 800, depending on the historian, are called the Dark Ages. They're called the Dark Ages for a couple of reasons. One, order pretty much fell apart in a great deal of Europe. The more realistic reason, however, is we have almost no documentation from that time. It's dark because we don't have much. We can only look at the archaeological record to see what went on. But the Dark Ages were localized. We like to think, oh, that happened around the world. It didn't. The Dark Ages were a European event. Now, great events are going on around the world elsewhere. The rest of the world didn't take a siesta during this. But there's more documentation. It's not dark from that sense. In 642, I'll back up even further. Muhammad was born in 570. He died in 632. And the years 600 to 800 saw massive growth in Islam. Islam is not a new religion. By 642, Arabs captured Damascus, Syria, Pakistan, and Egypt from the Byzantines. By 711, the Moors had Spain and had reached India. If it had not been for Charlemagne raising a very large army, the Moors would have had the largest European state, which was the Frankish Empire at that time, and probably most of Europe. By 750, the Toltecs move into the Valley of Mexico. By 800, the Maya states are in decline. In the eastern third of what will be the United States, the Mississippian culture dominates. In the southwest, the Anasazi and the Hobokans are beginning to create those incredible ceramics. In the Pacific area, Polynesian ancestors of the Maori reach New Zealand. In China, the Tang dynasty dominates a newly consolidated country. By the late 700s, Buddhism arrives in China. By 832, the government is persecuting the Buddhists. And in Africa, the kingdom of West Ghana rises with their incredible artwork.
Susan, why did the Romans leave?
Why did the Romans leave is the question. The barbarians were at the gate of Rome. There had been a number of barbarian sweeps coming in. Now, we're not talking about the Mongols yet, but the Huns and a lot of the Germanic tribes had gained in power. The Romans were failing as a culture, and so they were actually reaching Italy on their way to Rome. And so Rome called all the legions back to defend the home country. Back in Britain, the Romanized Celts worked very hard to maintain Roman culture and Roman administration. But overall, war is tearing that down. The most famous of the kings of the Western country in England at the time is a man called Vortigern. Now, what we know of him is as much legend as fact. Best we can figure, he ruled between 425 and 480. Vortigern may have been his name or his title. Vortigern means high king. He may have been pure Celt, or he may have had a Roman father named Vitellinus. We do know that he fought successfully against the Picts, against Irish raiders, and against his neighbors. We do know that in 449 he hired a band of Saxon mercenaries under two chiefs, Hengist and Horsa, to help him fight off the Picts. They won, and from there the stories vary wildly. The simplest story is that in thanks for their help, Vortigern gave Hengist and Horsa land. They settled there. More Saxons come, and in time they become an invasion force. The second story requires you to think that Vortigern is a total idiot. The second story says that after the Saxon mercenaries helped Vortigern beat the Picts, he refuses to pay them. And so, a little bit irritated by that, the Saxons burn a couple of villages, take everybody prisoner or kill everybody off, and decide to homestead the suddenly available land. And again, more Saxons come in and we have an invasion force. The third story is more along the lines of an Anglo-Saxon saga. It says that Vortigern, who was an already married man, fell in love with Hengist's daughter, Rowena. And so he divorces his wife and puts Rowena in her place. Now he has 3 sons, and they take exception to having mom divorced. And so they take some troops and they go to Vortigern's chief foe, another Roman Celt named Ambrosius Aurelianus. Now Ambrosius was working very hard to maintain Roman administration. He's one of the really Romanized Celts. Vortigern is more after power. And so the two men had been struggling for control of the area for quite some time. with Vortigern's son's help, Ambrosius Aurelianus beats Vortigern, sends him into exile, and consolidates the two kingdoms. However, while they are engaged in this war, more Angles and more Saxons attack the coast, and they still have the foothold on England. For a lot of researchers, Ambrosius Aurelianus and his very, very, very effective cavalry commander are the origins of the King Arthur tales. And it is true that Ambrosius's children end up in Wales and govern a great deal of Wales for a long time. And as you know, a lot of the King Arthur stories are set in Wales. If you're interested in exploring that, there are a lot of good books out right now looking at the possible genealogical or evolutionary background for the King Arthur tales. But on your list, Christopher Hibbert's book, The Story of England, and Mike Ashley's The Kings and Queens of England spends a couple of pages looking at that in detail. It's very interesting the way they approach that. Whichever story is the truth, and they're probably all a bit of the truth, the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes arrive in waves over 200 years. It might surprise you to know where the Angles and Saxons and Jutes came from. And in this class, those of you who are interested in where you came from, your genealogy, if you claim England, if you claim Scotland, if you claim Ireland, if you claim Wales, if you claim France, you may have to rethink that, because that's probably not your heritage. The Anglo-Saxons and Jutes came from southern Denmark, Jutland, and Lower Saxony. Jutland is a peninsula between the North and Baltic Seas. Denmark occupies part of it. Germany occupies part of it. Saxony is thought to be the original home of the Saxons, and it is in western Germany. Northern Germany. And so the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes are, for all practical purposes, Scandinavian. The Saxons took most of the southern part of England. They come in like this, and they move this way. The Angles come in here. They make a deal with the Picts, move up on the southern border, and take this part. The Jutes, which are the smallest of the three tribes, comes in and takes Kent. By 613, the Celts, who refuse to make common cause even in the face of this great invasion, have all fled to Scotland, Ireland, Wales, Cornwall, or across the sea to Brittany, or are enslaved. And the Saxons have set up 7 kingdoms, the Heptarchy. Wessex, Sussex, and Essex are the western Saxons, the southern Saxons, and the eastern Saxons. The kingdom of Kent is Jutish. East Anglia and Mercia and Northumbria are Anglian. Now, the only thing that held these 7 kingdoms together is a tradition that one of the kings is always declared the most powerful, the Bretwalda, to settle problems between the kingdoms, blood feuds, that kind of thing. And there's something else a little different about them in how they selected their kings. Unlike later peoples, all of the sons of a king and all of his grandsons are equally considered for the kingship. All of them are considered aethelings, A-E-T-H-L-I-N-G, which means throne-worthy. So just because you were born first does not mean you get the throne. Instead, when dad dies or is killed, the leading nobles, the witan, wise men, come together and they decide of all the sons and the grandsons who is the best candidate. And so they elect their kings. 600. The next 150 years, though, power flows between the various kingdoms. One king will take over as Bretwalda, another will take over as Bretwalda, and they balance the power that way. Over this period of time, the language they speak becomes known as Anglish, and then English. Anglo-Saxon is as much the root of our language as Latin or Greek. And no, the four-letter words that we say are Anglo-Saxon are not. Those words came later, in the later Middle Ages, when seafaring is a way of life. And a lot of those impolite words come from Holland. Now, I'm absolutely certain the Angles and Saxons and Jutes had their own cuss words. How could they not? But the interesting thing is, none of them came down to us in history. There's a good reason for that. Everything we know about the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes was written by monks in monasteries. And while some of them, notably a gentleman we'll talk about, the Venerable Bede, is very frank in describing what went on, they aren't that frank. And so we don't know. It is true that these are not a gentle people. The Anglo-Saxons worship the gods we identify as Norse today: Woden, Thunor, and Frigg. That's where we get the words Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. Their society was organized very differently from the Romans and the Celts. Instead of being based on how much you have, it was based on what you did. The nobles fought, the Charles farmed, the bondsmen and slaves labored. Now, when they convert to Christianity, they add a new class, those who pray. And that's exactly how they broke out their culture, by what you did. Slavery was common. Now, most slaves came from war and from raids, but you could also become a bondsman if you fell on hard times and could not take care of your family. But if that was your situation, it was a little different than being taken as a slave in a raid. Instead, you looked at the people around you and you found a loaf giver, someone who was rich enough to feed you and your family. And so you went to them and literally asked to be taken as their bondsman. And if they thought they could support you, then they would say yes. Now, it's still slavery, but it's a higher form of slavery. And so bondsmen often had their own oxen and cattle that they brought with them into bondage. Now, there must have been some way for them to earn money for them to maintain the ox and cow as their own. But we don't know enough about it to know how they did it. Now, some got a strip of land in the meadows where they could grow their own food or extra food to sell. So there's a great deal about that situation we don't really know. And we don't know how they felt about slavery. They don't tell us that. But we do have a lot of wills that they wrote in which they free their slaves. Slavery was also the punishment for some serious crimes, from theft to incest. You didn't get freed for those. War was the central theme of their culture. The social ladder and gathering of wealth depended on military service and the loot that you gathered. The villages were small and centered around a large hall that belonged to their chief or thane. Loyalty was the single most critical human attribute for them. All others were secondary. And if you are a military force, that's very understandable. Boys of 12 were considered old enough to give their oath to their chief and their king, an oath that would be held for life. But then life was short. They died in their 40s and their 50s. Marriage was a vital force in the culture. Saxon marriages were as much a political event as they were property dependent. And girls were expected to marry in their early teens. Women held the network of families and clans together. They were the spindle and distaff side of Anglo-Saxon life. In fact, there was an old Anglo-Saxon saying that said women were the weavers of cloth and of peace. One part of a church tract on betrothal survives. It says in part, if a man wishes to betroth a maiden or a widow, and it so pleases her and her kinsman, then it is right. And then it goes on to describe the betrothal. Sounds like she had some say, some autonomy, at least in who was chosen. We don't know, but that's pretty good evidence. Later, around 1030, one of the last of the Anglo-Saxon kings, who happened to be pure Danish, King Canute, actually wrote a very intricate code of law, and it included this: neither a widow or a maiden is ever to be forced to marry a man whom she herself dislikes. So he codifies in law what that betrothal statement said. The other clauses on marriage in Canute's code of law have to do with transfer of property. A woman had only two choices of career: marriage, and after they convert to Christianity, the church. However, in Anglo-Saxon days, young women did not choose to go into the church. It was widows and divorced women and women who otherwise lost or were abandoned by their husbands. It's later that young unmarried women come directly into the church. But a woman could have a lot of power and property from either of those two careers. Any number of documents, wills, betrothal statements, so forth, talk about how much land a woman could inherit and about how much power and control she had. A woman's dowry went to her, not to her husband, not to her family. What property she takes into the marriage, she brings out of the marriage. So Anglo-Saxon men were highly motivated to keep the marriage going. Anglo-Saxon women had more power and prestige than their Norman sisters will. If you want to explore that, and it's an interesting subject, I think, on your list, Robert Lacey's book, Life in the Year 1000, talks a lot about that. But I'll summarize a couple of wills for you. Wulfgar of Donegal left his lands to be run by his wife and daughters. A man named Wulfric settled 4 landed estates, gold, 30 slaves, and 30 horses on his betrothed. 2 copies were kept in the church, sort of a 1,000-year-old prenuptial agreement. And you thought we invented those too, right? The Anglo-Saxons are a little legalistic in their approach to life. If she was widowed, a woman kept her property and whatever her husband left her. A woman also had hereditary rights to property if there was no will or no designated heir. Many religious houses in the early days are co-ed. So there wasn't a separate convent and abbey. They were a consolidated, what's called a mixed house. And most of the mixed houses answered to an abbess, not an abbot. The most famous abbess was Hilda of Whitby. Now she goes on to be a saint, and so she would have been famous anyway, but for our historical purposes, she's most famous because she's the one that hosts the Synod of 664, in which the Celtic and Roman churches, that were two very different churches at the time, come together to agree on the ecclesiastical calendar. Now that's important because at that time, they didn't agree on when major feasts were, when Easter was held. They had a lot of different rules for how their priests operated. And so they come together in 664 to work out some of these differences. Several women ruled kingdoms alone. One of them led her troops in battle, and we'll talk about her before the end of the class. Divorce was possible but frowned upon. And as I said, a man would not particularly be motivated to divorce his wife if he's going to lose everything she brought with her. The Anglo-Saxons were very practical, and marriage was a political and property statement as well as anything else. And so they made it expensive and they supported marriage. Their approach to law-breaking was equally practical. While the most serious crimes were punished by slavery, For other crimes, you could pay for them, literally. They carefully developed a price list for crimes. The price had a sliding scale with it, depending on the status of the victim. And you paid that price, called a weirgild, directly to the victim. Of course, they have no prisons, as I said. They're very practical people. That was a practical approach. You can just check this list and see if I really want to bop this guy on the head, it'll cost me this. Is it really worth it or not? Not many things merited death, but treason did. The Anglo-Saxons and Jutes had a strong tradition of blood feud. And so this list of fines to pay for crimes was a very practical approach to holding down the blood feuds. If you could just go ahead and pay, then they couldn't declare blood feud against you. And so this was a control mechanism on their culture. But they were practical about any number of things. Offa of Mercia couldn't stop the Welsh raiders. You remember where Mercia is? Here. So he shares a border with Wales. And the Welsh raiders keep hitting his kingdom. And so what Offa does is he builds a dike, 179 miles long, 150 of which are pure dike, and 29 of which are mountains and steep crags and stuff that he built against. The dike, called Offa's Dike, is 20 feet high. In front of it is a ditch, 60 feet wide. This is a pretty determined man. Remember, all of this is hand power. But it worked. He slowed down the raids. One tradition of the Romans intrigued the Anglo-Saxons enough to adopt it, and that was to mint coins with your king's head on them. Not only did it formalize the weirgild, you could actually say against different coins, but it also stabilized transactions between the kingdoms. In October 2005, a 1,200-year-old Anglo-Saxon coin with the head of a king of Mercia who ruled from 796 to 821 sold for $409,000. Wish I had a handful. It is the most paid for any British coin. The Anglo-Saxons were magnificent poets. Remember reading Beowulf in high school? It was written between the 7th and 10th centuries. They were masters of heroic sagas. Now, those of you who read Beowulf probably don't remember it very fondly. It was very, very long and very, very hard to read. Well, think about the children in Anglo-Saxon times. They recited Beowulf from memory, first page to last page. But the interesting thing is now there's research going on that thinks that they did not recite them, they sang them. And they're experimenting with the different chords you can get from the instruments they used at the time, trying to decide how you might sing some of these. And they're very different when you sing them than when you say them. So they may be onto something. But these people also wrote riddles. They loved very exotic riddles. I was sharing with a couple of the class members before class. Riddles are 5 or 6 lines, and they describe things. So it was a way of sharpening your memory and your wits. And the one I was sharing, the answer was raw oysters, something we know very well. We have a lot in common with these people. They write bawdy songs. These are not Victorians, okay? They write great poems. When they convert to Christianity, they write terrific psalms and music for the church. And speaking of that, although they did not record anything, they didn't record their historic sagas, their music, their day-to-day life. When the monks come in to convert them, in the late 6th century, it is the monks who start writing all this down, frantically trying to capture it. And so that's why we don't have the cuss words, for one thing. But the other thing is you suddenly have this wealth of information from them. The Anglo-Saxons were also skilled metal workers. If you've ever been to a museum in England, you can see their shields were works of art. They had pictures of animal heads, dragons, birds flying across. It's interesting to note that when the monks come in and they suddenly begin creating the Anglo-Saxons, those glorious illustrated books that we see pictures of, next time you see one, check the imagery. It is not normal imagery that you would expect from the church. Instead, the Anglo-Saxons just took their normal icons off the shields and put them into the books. And so you have a lot of Celtic symbols, you have Roman symbols, you have Anglo-Saxon symbols. They don't really adopt the more church-like symbols for a couple of hundred years. They're a very stubborn people. And they were determinedly pagan. The Celtic Christian church converted the Irish in the 500s, and it's a flourishing church under St. Peter. And the Celtic church sends missionaries to the Picts, also Celts, in Scotland, but they don't try to take on the Anglo-Saxons. It is the Roman church who finally sends missionaries to the Anglo-Saxons in England. And in 597, Pope Gregory sends a man you may know about, a man named Augustine, also a future saint, to convert the Anglo-Saxons. In fact, he goes to Kent, okay, which was the home of the Jutes. And the king of Kent at the time, a gentleman named Aethelred, had married a Frankish princess, and he allowed her to set up a chapel in Canterbury. And so Gregory, hearing about this, says, well, maybe the man's open to new ideas. And so he sends Augustine to Kent. Well, Aethelred is not real thrilled about this new religion his wife is practicing. And so he will not allow Augustine into his home. Instead, he meets him outside under an oak tree, which of course was sacred, and in the open air so that any priestly magic would blow away. And he isolates Augustine on an island. Now, he allows his wife and some of her ladies to visit, but he keeps him there for several weeks while he decides how safe is this man. Now, Aethelred eventually converts, but only after nonstop prayers by his wife and Augustine. This is the first recorded religious filibuster. The faith does grow. Aethelred's daughter marries the king of Northumbria and converts him. But it takes over 100 years to convert most of the Anglo-Saxons. Edwin of Northumbria actually calls in his wise men to debate the two religions. Is this something you expect from 600? In a lot of ways, they were more sensible about things than we are today. We have eyewitness and first-hand reports of what's going on because now the monks are there, and they're not hidden away in monasteries. They're right there at court and in the towns, first trying to convert, but they're also writing all of this stuff down. One of the most prolific of the monks was a man named Bede. He's called the Venerable Bede for a couple of reasons. One, in respect for all of the many things he did, and two, because he lived, are you ready for this? All the way to 62. He was ancient. He lived between 672 and 735, and he is the first English historian. He's a fascinating storyteller. This is not dry dates. This is a man who's telling the story of what goes on. He's clear-eyed, he's funny, a little bit skeptical, which is interesting in a monk. He writes 68 books. Now, 68 books in a time when you wanted to write a book, you had to go kill a calf or a lamb to start creating the parchment and all the things that you had to do. Then you had to go out and dig galls out of trees to get the acid out of it to make your own ink. Then you had to find appropriate feathers, sharpen the end, and about every 4 words, sharpen the end again. And then you got to write them word by word, line by line. You did not write something lightly in those days, and he wrote 68 books. Now, of those 68 books, some were religious, as you might expect, but this is Bede. He writes a guide to spelling. Wouldn't you love to see a guide to Anglo-Saxon English spelling with all of those different spellings that you see in our books for them? He wrote a book on poetry, on philosophy, on science. His masterpiece was the Ecclesiastical History of England that he wrote in the late 600s. Doesn't that sound boring? It was not. It's actually a great history book, and it starts with Celtic England. And it talks about the Roman occupation, and then it brings the history up to date to where he is. He also writes a charming book on day-to-day life in the church at that time, what they're fighting over, what they're agreeing to. They're making up a lot of the ceremonies and rites at that time, and you get a first view of the things we take so much for granted. He's writing how they're making these things up. He's a treasure. Like James Madison's notes on the Constitutional Convention, Bede is a human treasure. And 60 years later, the world he describes for us so vividly changes dramatically. In 793, danger struck out of the north. Vikings from Norway raided Lindisfarne, the richest and most holy of the monasteries at that time. Alfred the Great, a king we're going to spend quite a bit of time with today, ordered up a follow-on to Bede called the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, written in English. And he describes this first attack a little dramatically, but then remember they're writing after the fact. Dire portents appeared over Northumbria. Immense whirlwinds and flashes of lightning and fiery dragons were seen flying through the air. A great famine followed, and a little after that, on the 8th of June, the ravages of heathen men miserably destroyed God's church at Lindisfarne. Now that's a little dramatic, but you kind of get the feeling about just how much trauma was associated with this. But it's not a surprise. Anglo-Saxon England was a rich prize. There were a large number of crops in the field, quarries and mines producing all kinds of minerals and ores. There were trade centers and towns, traders coming in from Gaul, bringing their goods. Large churches and religious communities, of course, had their special jeweled treasures. They collected taxes. Coinage was circulating among the communities. When you have wealth, you attract predators. What you find during this time is the Vikings are hitting monasteries and isolated hamlets. They hit the monasteries and hamlets because they're not well defended. These are easy targets. Now the monasteries they hit mostly because they want the gold, they want the jewels, they want the coins, whatever else the monks have. They kill most of the monks, but they will carry off some. And they kill most of the monks because the monks are defending pretty heavily the monastery. They don't have arms, but they don't want to give up the holy relics. And so they kill a lot of them. But the isolated hamlets and any monks that survive, they take off because slaves are a very valuable commodity. You can sell slaves in that time in any major port. Now, they did not take them slaves for their knowledge. They took them for their bodies to sell. What was happening to bring all these Vikings attacks is that life got too good in Norway and Denmark and Sweden. And the population grew very rapidly. The problem is there's not enough land. Too much of that land is uphill and down dale. There's not enough actual land that you can grow things and build things on. And so younger sons in particular found themselves with no land to build a home on, to build a family on. People were actually starving because the soil is poor and they couldn't grow enough crops to feed everybody. And because of that, there were a lot of minor warfare going on from people trying to take other people's land. And so a large number of warriors were sent into exile. When you lost, you were exiled. So you've got hungry people, you've got people who need things, you've got exiled people. What are they going to do? They go a Viking. They go raiding. And so marauding Vikings, mostly Danes and Norse, but not entirely, there were some Swedes too, they reached Constantinople. In 862, warring Slavs actually call in a Swedish Viking chief named Rurik. They ask him to settle their quarrels. He does. And the land is named after his people, the Rus. Russia is named after a Swedish Viking chief's people. Another group reached Spain and the north coast of Africa. Now the Moors fight them off, but not easily. So it is hardly surprising that they attack England. It is hardly a surprise that they go to Iceland and on to Greenland and then on to North America. If they can make it to Russia and Constantinople, almost no place is too far for them to get. And they do. Some raids may have occurred as early as 787 in England, but the first documented case we have is the one on Lindisfarne. The next year, they hit Bede's Jarrow. So essentially what happens over the next couple of years is the Norse, Vikings from Norway, come in. They come from the north, as you would expect, and they hit the monasteries and the isolated communities. They hit Lindisfarne, Jarrow, Whitby, and the communities there. They go over the top of Scotland. They hit several places in Scotland. They hit and stay in Ireland, and so they come from Ireland and hit Wales and parts of Cornwall. When the Danes come into the fight, they come in and kind of follow where the Saxons and the Angles came in. They come into Northumbria, into Anglia, into Kent, and into Sussex and Wessex. But in about 30 years, the warfare changes. For the first 30 years, you have isolated ships, raiders, 2 or 3 at a time, come in, they hit a small town, they hit a monastery, and they leave. But after about 30 years, things are getting worse at home. Large fleets come. They come with supplies to stay for several months. They come prepared to conquer. And they bring their families with them. In 843, King Aethelwulf of Wessex fought and lost to a Danish fleet of 35 ships. In 851, the men of Devon won against the Danes. In 852, a huge fleet of ships arrived on the Thames, raided Canterbury, and sent the Mercian king into exile. In the 860s, the kingdoms of East Anglia, Northumbria, and part of Mercia fell to Viking control. England was divided. The area below what's called the Watling Street, which was an old Roman road that connected London to Chester, in kind of an arc. Everything above that arc was now controlled by either Danish Vikings or Norse Vikings. Below it, Celt and Wales and Anglo-Saxon. England is literally 2 different sets of people. You can still see and trace where the Vikings went and what towns stayed Anglo-Saxon just by looking at their names. Towns ending in ham, Tun, Stow, and Ing are Anglo-Saxon. Viking towns end in by, Thorpe, Toft, or Scale. So you can look on a map and see where each settled and where they came together to begin to create a common people. Only Wessex remained free to face the Vikings. And Wessex produced one of the most remarkable men in all of English history, Alfred, the only English king called the Great. Now, Alfred was a modest man. He probably would have cringed to be called the Great. It was the Tudors, hundreds of years later, that stick that title on him. His people had two other titles for him. One was England's shepherd, and the other was England's darling. This is a statue that you will see near where they think Alfred was born. Alfred was born in Wessex at Wantage in 849. He was the grandson of King Egbert of Wessex. Now, Egbert was a problem child. He was the son of the King of Kent. He was created so much trouble, his father exiled him when he was a young man. And he went to Offa's court in Mercia. But he caused trouble there too. And he worried Offa's son-in-law, a man named Beorhtric, who was the king of Wessex at the time. And the reason he worried Beorhtric is that Egbert and Beorhtric were cousins. They shared a grandfather. And remember Anglo-Saxon rules. All of the sons and grandsons are equal candidates for the throne. And he was afraid, Beorhtric was afraid, the Witan might like Egbert better or might choose him over Beorhric's sons. And so he gets his brother-in-law, Offa, to exile him. They were right to be worried. When Offa dies without an heir and Beorhtric dies without an heir, Egbert comes back. He is elected by the Witan to be king of Wessex and promptly attacks Mercia, takes Mercia, attacks his father's kingdom of Kent, takes Kent, and then East Anglia. But while he is taking on the kingdoms, nobody's checking the coasts until the Vikings are attacking closer and closer. Egbert was the last Bratwalda when he died in 838. His son Aethelwulf and grandson Aethelred pretty much spent their reigns fighting against the Danes. Alfred was the youngest, and either the fourth or the fifth son. Many of the stories about him come from a biography written in, are you ready for this, 893, by a monk named Asser, A-S-S-E-R. Asser was from Wales and was a contemporary and a friend of Alfred. He wrote the biography while Alfred was still alive. He describes a man of remarkable gifts, devout, humane, devoted to the interests of his people, scholarly, is brave in battle, careful of his time, so his studies don't interfere with his duties. In fact, Alfred was so worried that he would spend too much time at his studies, because that's really where he wanted to be, that he invents a graduated candle with lines in it so he can keep up with time. When it burns down, he knows so much time has passed. Now, he comes up with a problem, though, because if there's too much wind or not enough wind, that affects how fast the candle is burning, especially if it blows out. And so he carves a cow's horn with holes in it for ventilation and puts over the candle so the candle will burn at an even rate. This is a very creative man. Now, still, Asser was a friend, and so historians worry that maybe there's a little bit of idolatry going on here, or protection. You really don't want to write nasty things about your king when he's your friend reading over your shoulder. But there are enough other corroborating stories, and Asser's biography is very even-toned throughout, so they're pretty sure the stories about Alfred are good. We have no existing physical description or drawing. Asser only says Alfred was no giant in height or strength, and so the statue is more ideal than real. No one expected Alfred to be king. He's the youngest. He's kind of his dad's pet. Now, he does not learn to read until he's 12, but as soon as he does, he's hungry to read everything he can. He is a scholar, a lawgiver, and a warrior. Like most Anglo-Saxon children, he learned the great tales and recited them by heart. When he was 4, his dad sent him to Rome with a delegation to ask for help against the Danes. Can you imagine sending your 4-year-old that distance? Pope Leo IV received him and is supposed to have dressed him as the Roman consul, stood him up on a table and introduced him to his court as a future leader of his country and his faith. A few years later, he goes back to Rome on a pilgrimage with his father. This time when they come back, they stop at the Frankish court of Charles the Bald. And Alfred falls in love with the pageantry and the color. And in time, he will model his own court on the Frankish court. Now, as the youngest son, Alfred was probably being groomed for the church, and that explains all those trips to Rome. But these are not peaceful times. Alfred will not end up in the church. Instead, he becomes his brother's second in command in the fight against the Danes. In 863, Alfred married Ealhswith, a member of the Mercian royal family. In 871, the brothers fought a series of massive battles that ended with a victory at Ashdown. But Aethelwulf is killed. And so the Witan have to choose a new king. They pass over 4 brothers and Aethelwulf's 2 young sons to pick Alfred as king. Then word comes that there's a massive Viking army gathering and is going to march on Wessex. He's just survived this series of battles. He's in no shape to face anybody, much less a huge army. Wessex is doomed. But you know, funny things happen. That huge Viking army splits apart. We don't know why. Somebody fought with somebody died, something happened. We don't know what. But part of this huge army gets on their ships and goes back to Norway. Part of the army just settles in Northumbria. And only half of the troops stay in the field under a Dane named Guthrum. But even that's more than Alfred thinks he can safely face. So he meets up with Guthrum, and they make a deal. And Alfred pays him jewels and coins. He pays a Danegeld, protection money, for them to go away. They sign oaths, they exchange hostages. Things should be okay, right? Well, a couple of years later, on Twelfth Night, January 878, Guthrum surprised the royal town of Chippenham. He captures the court, and he almost captures Alfred. Alfred and a small band of men take to the fens of Athelney, kind of like Francis Mary and the Swamp Fox of our Revolutionary War. He uses the bogs as a defensive stronghold, comes out and raids the Danes and comes back. Asser describes what life was like in the fens, and that the letters and how he describes it sounds like letters from the early days in Valley Forge. A life of great distress and hunger amidst the woody and marshy places of Somerset. Nothing to live on except what could be foraged from raids, reduced to begging. They're cold, they're hungry, they're wet. One of the most famous Alfred stories occurs about this time. He takes refuge with a swineherd's family. Now, they don't know who he is. They obviously know that he's not one of them, but they don't know who he is. And he's sitting by the fire. He's making plans, he's thinking, and he doesn't notice that the swineherd's wife has put loaves of bread in the fire, and they start to char. And the swineherd's wife comes back in, and here he's sitting right next to the fire, and they're burning. And she goes over to him and she says, "Excuse me, are you noticing?" She really scolds him. I mean, he's burning dinner, for heaven's sakes. What's going on here? Well, Alfred accepts it very meekly. And Englishmen love this story because for them, this is a king humbled by circumstance, reacting with grace under pressure. Now, stories change over time, as we all know. And if you read that story today, the swineherd's wife's loaves of bread are now cakes. Well, they weren't cakes in those days. They might have been flat, round loaves of bread, but a poor swineherd's wife would not have been making cakes. But history's a little bit like yeast. Things expand in time. In 878, Alfred decisively the Danes. The resulting treaty confined them to East Anglia and to Sussex. And so where he only had this little bit, he's now moved up and will actually continue in time. Alfred rules Wessex, Essex, Mercia, and Kent. The defeat persuaded Guthrum and 30 of his warriors to convert. Must have been some reason why they got beat. And so they convert to Catholicism. Alfred stood godfather to Guthrum. The Vikings, though, are now permanent settlers in the country. The victory brought Alfred 6 years or 8 years of peace. During that time, he built a formidable chain of 30 forts and fortified towns called burhs, from which we get the word burrow. Now, he set them up in a very smart way. He set them up along the border so that no one was ever more than 20 miles away. If you needed to hightail it to get protection, you were never more than 20 miles from a fortified town or a fort. Many of these places will become major cities, like Oxford and Hastings. He designed and built a fleet of longships based on the Norwegian plan, only they're longer and faster. Ironically, his new ships that are now defending the coast from the Norse coming down, and they're defending here, force the Vikings onto France, where they will settle in an area called Normandy, the land of the men from the north, and from which another invasion will come next week. Later Englishmen name Alfred the father of the Royal Navy. Now, just as George Washington had a problem in our revolution, Alfred has a problem in that if he keeps calling people to stay in the field in the army, they worry about their families. Their families starve. There's nobody to work the fields. And he knows now that he is not going to be able to go on to a peacetime stand. And so what he does is reorganize the army, really into 3 separate forces. One is a permanent force that garrisons the fortified towns and forts. The other 2 he splits and they rotate. Half are always home and half are always in the field. And so at no time have you got everybody under arms, and you can cover the families that way. 900 years later, in the earliest days of the colonies of this country, the militia operates very much the same as Alfred planned. In 886, when Alfred captured London, he was proclaimed sovereign lord of all the English people not subjected by the Danes. I hope that was easier to say in English. For the first time, a man is called king of all the Anglo-Saxons. Some coins of the time call him king of the English, but that's a title his grandson will actually carry. And then Alfred really came into his own. This is a man who deserves the title he got. He restored pillaged churches. Remember, he's devoted to the church, but he does an interesting thing at this point. He translates a book on pastoral care written by Pope Gregory that tells the bishops and the priests and the monks what their responsibilities are for the people. He wants to make sure that if he gives them back their churches, they don't abuse the power. And that's what the book on pastoral care is about. He sends a personal copy, written in English, to all of his clergy. He found schools. He set scholars to work on the writing histories and translating the books that heretofore have been written in Latin. He commissioned translations into English of, in his own words, certain books which are the most necessary for all men to know. This is not a literate society. And here is a man who says it's important to be literate. These are things we all should know. Now, he meant the sons of nobles, but even that is an incredible idea when only a few monks learned to read. Alfred himself translated Bede's history into English. Astoundingly, Alfred truly believed and said knowledge was a primary condition of exercising power. I know some modern people who don't understand that. A society needs not only good government, but also learning. And he implements the requirement for his noble sons to learn to read, to go to school and read those books. He's remarkable in another way that most of us can't manage, and that is he studies other people's ideas, even as enemies, and adopts the best from each. We've already talked about the fact that he designed the longships based on the Norse ships. He creates a code of law that is an amazing compilation of legal ideas from as much of the world as he gets access to, and as we know, he visited some far-off places. He issued his new code of law, his very comprehensive code of law, in English, because he said he wanted his people to be able to read it, to understand it, and to explain it to each other. I'm not sure we can explain some of our laws to each other today, and it's all in English, or sort of in English. He recognized the rights of his Danish subjects. Their culture, their religion is protected by law. Now, slavery was still legal, but he tried to take on the problem of the blood feuds. And he introduces a grace period. So if someone harms someone else, before you can declare a blood feud, a certain amount of time has to pass so that both parties are equally ready for the battle, and hopefully so that they cool down enough to agree to a weregild. In 891, Alfred instigated the creation of an historical journal called the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles. The Chronicles were written in English and reported the political, the economic, the social events of the day. The first one comes out in the year 891. It is added to and updated every year until 1154. When Alfred died at 50 in late 899, the England he controlled was united. He had given the Angles and Saxons and Jutes and some Norse and Danes a common cause. They were a common people. Alfred and Ealhswith have 4 children. 3 made history. Their daughter Elfrida married Baldwin, Count of Flanders. Their great-great-great-granddaughter Matilda will marry William the Conqueror. Another of those weird ironies history is so fond of. His son Edward turned his father's mostly defensive war into an offensive war and takes most of England. Daughter Aethelred, and I'll show you that since that's kind of an unusual name. Aethelred, Lady of the Mercians, leads her own troops when her husband dies. She joins brother Edward in the war against the Danes. She ruled Mercia alone for 8 years. She built burhs like her father did. She knew a good idea when she saw it. She led an expedition against raiding Welsh in 916 before returning to the Danish front lines. William of Malmesbury later wrote of her, she protected her own men and terrified aliens. Now we're talking about Danish here. We're not talking about UFOs. In 918, the Danes of York were so impressed by her, they volunteered to join her forces. She dies the next year. If you like the what-ifs, it's always interesting to think what she might have accomplished had she lasted longer. Alfred's grandson, Eadred, finally defeats the last of the Norse. He incorporates Northumbria formally into England in 954 and is proclaimed king of all the English. But it is his son, Edgar the Peaceable, sort of, who is the first to be crowned king of the English on October the 1st, 959. Edgar's no warrior. He is a great administrator. His real skill is knowing a good person when he sees him. And so he picks great leaders and great officers and great administrators. And he's lucky enough to have a kingdom that's pretty much at peace during his reign, because his personal life is not that peaceful. Now the jury's still out. We don't know if Edgar really is the rounder that time portrays him, or whether he made some really bad enemies. But depending on who you read, you get very different ideas of Edgar. One says, now we do know he had a lot of affairs, The man had a very active libido. And one story says his wife refused to live with him because the affairs got too public. Another story says that he seduced a young woman. She got pregnant, bore him a child, and then went to or was forced to a convent. His enemies said no, she was a nun when he seduced her. Then he had an affair with a married woman named Elfrida. When her husband died, his enemies said that Elfrida and Edgar helped his death along so they could marry. Edgar is crowned king long after becoming king, and only 2 years before he dies. His enemies said it was because he was so dissolute, that the Archbishop, Dunstan, refused to crown him until he promised to do better. Now, he does make a promise. He makes a very interesting promise. The promise is a written document in which Edgar says, are you ready for this? This is in 973. The promise says, the king is accountable to his people for his actions. This document, and one Canute writes, will come back to haunt King John in Class 3. The unscandalous version for the late crowning is that Edgar didn't want to be crowned until he felt like he was fully in control of the country. Whatever version you prefer, the coronation ceremony is pretty much unchanged today. Elfrida is crowned queen and Edgar is crowned king of all the English. Edgar's son Edward succeeded him. The 16-year-old is so violent, his stepmother Elfrida, his 10-year-old half-brother Aethelred, and their servants murdered him, supposedly. He was murdered. He was stabbed in the back and dragged by a bolting horse. The murder occurred during a visit to his stepmother. His half-brother Aethelred is his heir, so there's plenty of motive. Elfrida was certainly implicated in the crime. But since her son Aethelred becomes king afterwards, she never goes to trial. Edward was declared a martyr. And much later, after people forgot just how unpleasant he was sanctified. Aethelred is remembered mostly for his nickname, Aethelred the Unready. The nickname was really a pun on his name. Ethel means noble, and red meant counsel. Throughout his reign, he's badly advised and unable to make or keep to a decision. And so unready in Old English was redless, meaning ill-advised or lacking counsel. He does institute a law code that ordered the shire reeve and the 12 chief magistrates in each locality to swear, you ready? To accuse no innocent man, nor conceal any guilty one. The first English references to a sworn jury before the year 1000. It is the beginning of the grand jury, which we still have in this country today. The 12-man jury is a gift of the Danes. The Danish attacks start again. After the Danes burn Southampton and London and destroy an English army at Malden, Ethelred pays a Dane geld of 16,000 pounds. Protection money. Please just go away. I'll pay you. There's precedent. Alfred did it. But Ethelred is no Alfred. And he's not facing a united force. There are lots of separate Danish bands. And each one attacks and comes in with a higher price tag to go away. And so after he pays 3 and 4 and 5, he pretty much beggars the country. Monasteries and convents are attacked. The army must stay in the field. Harvest fails. Ethelred had no military skill and seemed to pick exactly the wrong men to lead. His worst mistake was on November the 13th, 1002. He ordered the murder of every Dane who lived in England, except those in the Danelaw. The massacre was carried out, probably not wholesale, but a lot of people died. And that brought Sven, king of Denmark, into the battle, because Sven's sister Gunhild and her husband were two of the Danes killed. And Sven takes that rather personally. So the separate Danish bands are now a combined army. They sweep into the Danelaw, gather more troops, and bear down on Aethelred. By 1013, Sven controlled England and was proclaimed king. 40 days later, he died unexpectedly, and no, we don't know why. So the Witan, trying to figure out what to do, calls Aethelred back in. He says, well, we really never disposed you, Sven did. You be king again. And he is king for 2 years. But he's not in good health, so really the Witan is more in rule than anybody else. He dies. They decide to pick his son, Edmund Ironside. He dies. They're out of Aethelings. But remember Edmund, he'll come back next week, not personally. In 1016, Sven's son Canute succeeded to the throne. And England becomes part of a Scandinavian empire, because Canute rules a newly consolidated Denmark, Norway, part of Sweden, and now England. But England is his crown jewel. And next week we will explore what a Danish king does for the idea of what the king owes his people.